So we have now Professor Stephen Kotkin. He is a senior fellow at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and an emeritus professor at Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs, where he has taught for 33 years. A UC Berkeley PhD, his research spans geopolitics and authoritarian regimes. His acclaimed works include Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, and Magnetic Mountain. He has also written extensively on communism's collapse and Soviet history, with forthcoming volumes on Stalin and the USSR. A consultant on geopolitical risk and a frequent contributor to major publications, Professor Kotkin has been recognized as a Guggenheim Fellow and an NEH Fellow, among other honors. It's a pleasure, sir, to have you amongst us.
Thank you. Thank you.
An equally distinguished moderator, Vinay Sitapati, is currently a professor of law and politics at Shiv Nadar University, Chennai. He was previously associate professor with tenure at Ashoka University and a visiting associate professor at Princeton University. He has degrees from National Law School, Bangalore, and Harvard Law School, and a PhD in politics from Princeton University. His dissertation focused on the impact of court judgments. Aside from articles in scholarly journals and newspapers, he has written 2 books. It's a pleasure to have you both with us at this 3rd edition of the Chennai Literary and Arts Festival. So without further ado, I hand over the proceedings to Vinay to carry on the conversation.
Thank you very much. So Stephen, of course, is perhaps the expert on Soviet Union, Russia, Eastern Europe. I first discovered him even before I met him when I read Magnetic Mountain, which is it's a history of a steel city, Stalin's steel city. We in India are deeply familiar with this idea. Think of Bhilai, Bokaro. These were steel cities and built for the same reason, right? Yesterday, Stephen was at Shiv Nadar University where he saw an ambassador. And he said, I understand that, right? And the person who owns that ambassador has bought a second ambassador so that he has spare parts for the first ambassador. And when we told Stephen, he said, I understand that, right? So in some sense, even though he's a scholar of Russia, I think he understands the pathologies of pre-1991 India very, very well. So Stephen, I want to begin with a story in 1953. Your Stalin, not our Stalin, has just died. And there's a memorial in central Chennai. A young political leader, Karunanidhi, attends the memorial and on the spur says that a son of mine has just been born and I'm going to name him Stalin. And cut to today, when he's the chief minister, the equivalent of the governor of this state, this province. And so the first question I want to ask you is, what is this romance we have with Stalin and with Russia, we being Indians? And can you draw a line from that moment in 1953 to recent events where we voted neutral on Ukraine, right? Is there a line that you can draw, and what are the underlying pathologies?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So I was told there's a fantastic literature and art festival here in Chennai. And there are great authors, and it should not be missed. So I said, sure, that's a great idea. In fact, I discovered that The Golden Road was going to be one of the books presented here. More recently, I discovered that I am on the program. So this was a bit of a surprise, and a nice surprise, very pleasant surprise. So I thank you for that. It's wonderful to be here. You're asking me about Indian fascination with Russia, and that would be the kind of question I would ask of you rather than of me, in all honesty. So for someone like myself who spent too many years studying Joseph Stalin, his life, and the context, his accumulation of dictatorial power, his transformation of the dictatorship into a despotism, his murderous policies across all of Eurasia, touching other continents as well. 18 to 20 million deaths directly attributable to Stalin. Archival documents that I have touched with my own hands and read with the blood of people who are interrogated and tortured and murdered during the interrogation. Eyeballs that fell out on the paperwork during interrogation, and I could go on. Reports to him of starvation and his response to increase the levies on the peasants while they were starving. Having experienced this firsthand, I have to say I don't think there's anyone alive who has seen more paperwork of Joseph Stalin than I have. Really hundreds of thousands of pieces of paper over a really long period of time. Very disturbing in many ways. It's bizarre for me to think that someone would name their child after him. Certainly I would not have done that. Now again, when one is in a different place, in a different time, one has to understand with empathy, not with rejection, how someone could have done that. And so there are a couple of reasons potentially that I would conjecture, but again, I think you're better positioned to answer your own question. So the Soviet Union arose after the implosion of Imperial Russia. So they lost this grand empire, they lost the monarchy, they lost everything. And then within a generation and a half, they were a great power again. Reconstituted not all, but much of the lost territory of the Tsarist Empire, built a military-industrial complex on a very significant scale. In 1941, had the largest and best armed military in the world when attacked by Hitler. Won the war in alliance with the US and the UK and other powers, but nonetheless was on the winning side of that war. And rose even further from that destruction of the war into a military parity with the United States by the 1970s. So this is astonishing. It doesn't happen often. And so alongside the famine and the murders and other things that we could discuss in detail, there is this other story of a peasant country whose empire is lost, whose regime implodes, that is resuscitated and is victorious in the largest, deadliest war ever. And of course, Stalin is the central figure in all of that. So if you're imagining the transformation of a poor country, if you're imagining the rise of a country that has a proud history, long and proud over a millennium or perhaps more than that, you look at that and you could rationalize and say, well, sure, many people died, but maybe that was the cost of modernization. Sure, there were many mistakes and excesses and errors, but nonetheless, maybe they achieved something grand there. The problem with that argument is that there are many ways to modernize a country without having to kill 20 million of your own citizens, as many other countries have shown. Moreover, the superpower status of the Soviet Union was ephemeral because the Soviet Union imploded just as the Tsarist regime had earlier. And so, in many ways, Stalin won the war, but he lost the peace. The post-Soviet military, the troops of Russia, retreated from their advanced positions attained during the war, all the way back to territory past what Peter the Great had succeeded in attaining. And they retreated along the exact same roads as Napoleon's forces had retreated in 1812, only in the opposite direction. So the grand edifice turned out to be not very secure, not very stable, not very enduring. It looked massive and impressive to some people at the time, and certainly on the military side. Their military-industrial complex was very formidable, as we see the legacy of that today in action. But in the fullness of time, it would be hard to see the sentiment of 1953 enduring, given what we know about that regime and given what happened to that regime. So while I can have some empathy and understanding for the moment in time and for the image of the Soviet Union, for a poor country looking to rise and looking to assert its sovereignty in the international system, I think it's a mirage.
Why do you think India still retains a soft spot for Russia, as evidenced by the Ukraine votes? Is it that we're worried about too tight a hug with the US? Is it because we need Russian weaponry? Or is some of it this kind of anti-colonial nostalgia? We still have it.
Again, I don't know why you're not answering these questions. I mean, most of the people in the audience could do better than I could, and I know that you could do better than I could because I've heard you on that question. So on the situation in the world today and India's place in this, betting on Russia now or any time in the past 20 years as a partner for enhancing one's position in the world never struck me as a wise bet. Russia's aspirations exceed its capabilities. It wants to be a power of the first rank. It wants to be, again, on parity with the US. It wasn't on parity economically ever. Russia's economy, even in the most generous estimates when it was the Soviet Union, was no more than about 2/3 of American GDP, not that much less than the China comparison today. China's GDP, depending how you measure it, is not that different from the Soviet GDP vis-a-vis America, by the way. Anyway, I would say that because the aspirations exceed the capabilities, they're constantly trapped in this grand strategy or failing grand strategy of seeing the state as the instrument to manage the gulf between them and the powerful West. And so they use the state instrument to browbeat the society, to force modernize the society, to try to catch up or at least manage the gap with the West. And the problem with that approach is it can have a spurt. There can be, a boom or a boomlet. Can last a while. It was a significant spurt in the Soviet Union of economic growth. It was less significant in Putin and the Russia case, but still it was there. And then they hit the wall. So the forced modernization with the state as the instrument works only temporarily, and then it turns out to be a cul-de-sac. And the gap widens. Instead of closing the gap, the very reason that the Putin regime takes these harsh measures and sees the state as an instrument of forced modernization was to close the gap, and the gap only widens. And even worse, the building of a strong state to manage this gulf between their aspirations and capabilities, between Western achievements and their own, devolves into personal rule. And so you don't actually get a strong state. You get a personalistic dictatorship. The Tsarist regime had a version, the Soviet regime had a version, and now Putin's regime is another version. It's a pattern. It's a 300-year-old pattern. And it doesn't serve the country well. They don't have a high per capita GDP as a result. They don't have a dynamic economy. They're instead a commodity exporter trying to underwrite this personalistic dictatorship. And so they lose a lot of their best people. They hemorrhage huge amounts of human capital. enormous numbers of Russian educated elites have left the country, either voluntarily or fearing arrest. And so the mortgaging of the future, losing your human capital, Russia's new economy, the high-tech economy, is in Tel Aviv. And it's in Armenia, Yerevan, Armenia, and many other places, Silicon Valley, where I live. And that's not a good place to have your private economy, IT sector, your new economy, your young people. And so it's not a model that works for Russia, let alone for the grief that's caused for Russia's neighbors. Right? And so for those of us who are positively inclined towards Russia, after all, I've spent my life traveling there and studying it, it actually hurts us to see what's happened to the country now. And so as a model of fascination, you would have to explain to me how, knowing what I know about the Russian model and its failures, its repeated failures through history. This is not something that happened recently. Right? This is, again, a 300-year-old pattern where they overinvest in the military, they overinvest in the secret police, they have an autocratic regime that denies the liberties and property rights of its own people. They have a massively corrupt elite that steals everything that's nailed down and then everything that's not nailed down. And so I wonder, now again, I understand the quest for one's sovereignty in a world dominated by other powers. I understand the desire for faster modernization to raise the standard of living. So I understand the quest for autonomy or strong sovereignty in the world, and I understand the quest for raising the living standards of the people. But Russia doesn't deliver that for its own people. So that being a model seems to me a problematic question. But again, I defer to you to explain why that enduring fascination is there.
Well, I want to ask a little bit about what do you think India should do, not the constraints. Should India embrace a US-led world order, and why? Or should it continue playing footsie with many other rising powers?
Yeah, I mean, again, who am I to give advice to you? There is a civilization here that predates the existence of America and that shaped the neighboring civilizations of the whole world. It's a world culture, a world civilization. We were at the evidence of that 2 days ago, thanks to your hospitality.
In Mahabalipuram.
And so, yes. So I find it strange that I would be in a position. Of course, every America goes abroad to lecture other people how to live. I understand that that's the stereotype, which of course is true. But I want to avoid doing that. But I'll say this. You want to be a colony of China? Go right ahead. You're a sovereign nation. You go right ahead if that's what you want. Because they're playing for keeps. And they're going to dominate Asia if they're allowed to. Because that's what they say. Publicly, it's what they say in their internal documents, and it's how they behave. You can ask the people living up in the mountains here what that's like. You can ask the Australians when the Chinese tried to impose those 14 demands. Because the Australian Prime Minister asked for an inquiry into where COVID might have come from. After all, that's a reasonable question, given the number of victims globally, including in this country. And so I see that, and I think, okay, if I were living in that neighborhood, and that country was saying what it's saying and doing what it's doing, I would be looking for ways to ensure my sovereignty, my freedom of maneuver in the world, and also my self-strengthening at home so that I could meet that challenge. If you look around, what are the options? What are the possible partners? How could you possibly meet that question? I don't know. I mean, you tell me. I see that there is a country that has the largest economy in the world, the most dynamic economy by far, the largest innovation ecosystem. I see 6 million plus South Asians prospering inside that economy, many of them recent arrivals. You know better than I do. I see that country having almost 80 treaty partners with mutual obligations entered into voluntarily by the countries looking to enhance their security. And when those countries decide they don't want the U.S. as a partner anymore, they can decide that, and the U.S. is forced to recognize that sovereign behavior. The Philippines kicked the United States out, removed the U.S. from the military bases, said you have to go, and the United States left. And Subic Bay was one of the great military bases that the U.S. was using anywhere in the world. And the U.S. was forced to go home when the Philippines decided to exercise their sovereign rights of not continuing U.S. basing rights. Of course, now they've changed their mind, the Philippines. But I see that as an option, very interesting. And then I look around and what are the other options? And so if you tell me there's a better option than that to manage the neighborhood in which you live, then go for it. And if you don't find a better option than that, now having said that, India's main challenge is domestic. Right? India has to continue on a pathway of success. It has to invest in its people and its human capital. It has to build out its infrastructure. And it has to continue to improve its governance, because quality governance is the key variable for everything else. So if you can invest in your young people, not just at 15 or 20 elite universities, the cream of the cream, but broadly throughout the society, and if you can turn that gigantic population into human capital by investing in them, and if you can provide the kind of infrastructure that is necessary for a 21st century economy, and if your governance improves, again, it's not about the size of the government, small or large, it's about the quality of the government, right? And that's at every level, the national level and the local level. If you can do those things in the first instance, then you can, in some ways, provide for your own security. But everything is relative. And so, you know, when my daughter was 6 and we played football, I could take the ball away from her. And then she was 13, 14, captain of the team, and I couldn't get near the ball when she was carrying it. You know, so all power is relative. So India invests in itself and rises in stature, but has to compete against something very large looming over its neck. And so I see that as an option. Now, of course, there are many downsides that are in perception of being aligned with U.S. power in the world. The United States has many domestic problems, well known in this country. The United States commits many mistakes, and worse than mistakes, in its foreign policy. We all know about the Iraq War of 2003, which, by the way, I did not support. I had arguments with the executive editor of the New York Times and the editor of the New Yorker, who were both in favor of the war, and I was against it. Okay, I was a small nobody, no influence, etc., but nonetheless, at least I had presence of mind. And so there are many aspects of American power that are deeply unsatisfying. And the Americans can be very hypocritical. They can promise to certain ideals and then not live up to them. The Americans can be very self-interested. They can talk the talk about universal values and then, of course, feather their own nests for their own investors, etc. I get all that. What's the alternative? That's my challenge to you. In other words, if there's something better, I know what American power is, I know its strengths, and I know its limitations, and if there's something better on the horizon that you think would secure India's sovereignty and domestic development, by all means. And if there isn't, I think being partners with American power has certainly played out very well for most of those countries that have done so. Those who have opposed American power have not done that well. You can ask Nazi Germany, you can ask Imperial Japan, you can ask the Soviet Union, you can ask today's Russia, whether opposing something like American power is possible, successful, and in their interests. There are many cases where it didn't work. And then you can ask those who have partnered with America at some level, including post-Nazi Germany, post-imperial Japan, and many others. You can ask the Chinese, who are the greatest beneficiaries of the American-led international order and have now decided it's a threat to them, even though it was within that order that the entrepreneurialism and hard work of the Chinese produced that miracle that we all know. I've been traveling to China for most of my adult life. I mean, I don't remember the Boxer Rebellion, but I'm old enough to know what China looked like. And so I see this as an opportunity for India to explore, but that's not up to me, that's up to you.
Fair. I want to move back a little bit, Stephen, from today and India's options in an American-led order with other options, to your two books on Stalin. Now, I've read both of them. Each of them are about 1,000 pages, right? 900 pages each.
Yes, but as my wife says, they read like no more than 600.
And, I'm interested a little bit in the fascination with, or the respect Stalin still commands, your Stalin, not our Stalin, within the global left, and especially within the communist movement. And it's a bit paradoxical because no one killed more communists than Stalin.
He killed more German communists than Hitler did.
It's astonishing, right? And the first book ends with Stalin's decision to collectivize.
Yes.
And the second book ends with Hitler's invasion, right? 91, and I'm
Yes.
not going to ask him the question. He dreads when's the third volume coming. But both of these were extraordinary acts of violence.
Yes.
And yet, today, within the left, the conversation is always on the second act of violence, and very little on the first act of violence, which is the decision. 90% of the Soviet countryside are property, where 90% of the citizens live, there are property rights, there is something resembling market exchange, and by force Stalin collectivizes, which means that he takes off their property rights, he forces them to stay on the land that is now not their own. That's like prison, right? Home imprisonment.
Yes.
And he murders and starves millions of people.
Yes.
And the powerful thing I find in the book is that it was because he was a communist, not despite it. Now,
Yes.
This is not to say that all communists do this, but I'm quite persuaded, and I want you to talk a little more about that even Trotsky or many of the others didn't disagree with him on principle, but he was the only man with the guts to implement. Why is it that the collectivization piece and the murder there, which is higher than the murder from the purges, is so less known than the purges story?
Yeah, that's a hard one, but we'll try. So think about it this way. Marx's theory is feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism. So the Communist Party is building socialism on the way to communism. So transcending capitalism towards socialism, eventually communism. So that's why it's called the Communist Party, even though it's building socialism. They have the stages theory of history, as everyone knows well. So everything depends on whether that socialism is superior to capitalism. Because if the socialism is not superior to capitalism, there's kind of no reason to build socialism and eventually communism. So everything depends on the image and reality of capitalism. Now, capitalism is a term that the socialists introduced in the 19th century. There's actually no such thing as capitalism. There's kind of reality, market relations, society, but capitalism is this idea that the socialist writers, not just Marx, in the 19th century introduced because they want to transcend that. They name it as a stage that they want to get beyond. And it's transcendence in the Hegelian sense, this Aufhebung, right? Okay. So if you think about this image and reality of capitalism in the period 1917 through 1941, the first 24 years of the revolution in the former Russian Empire. If you think about the image and reality of capitalism, what is it? Well, it's imperial rule around the world. I don't have to explain to this audience, right? British India, and even worse in some cases in other places, which is saying a lot. So you have imperialism all over the whole globe. Africa, Asia, so that's not a very positive image and reality of capitalism. And then you have the interwar Great Depression, when millions and millions of people lose their jobs for reasons that are hard to discern if you're the average working person. So you have this bank failure and this terrible crash of the banks, and then you have mass unemployment, and what's that about? And then there's the militarism. You have the fascist militarism in the first instance, the Italian case, and to an even greater extent, the German case. So if you think about capitalism in the period between the First and Second World War, when Stalin, among others in the ragtag Bolshevik cohort, are building this thing, socialism on the way to communism, it's imperial rule, uninvited and nasty. It's Great Depression and mass unemployment. And it's fascist militarism. So against that, a lot of people could think, yeah, we need an alternative. And even if that alternative doesn't live up to its promises, even if there's a lot of violence with the alternative, the idea is that, sure, socialism has problems, it has excesses, but hey, capitalism, do you like that? Do you like imperialism? Do you like mass unemployment? Do you like fascist militarism? You know, as Orwell said in Animal Farm, do you want to go back to the era of the manor farm? Do you want to go back to the previous way of living? And so people kind of soldiered on, even though there was disappointment after disappointment, which you could explain away. It was a mistake, or we didn't intend to do this. And so that's part of the answer, the image and reality of capitalism. And then, of course, if you look at post-World War II, it turns out that the empires get overthrown. There's decolonization across the globe. It's not a linear process. It's not an easy process. There's a lot of violence. I don't have to tell this audience. But nonetheless, after a certain number of years, really one generation, the whole world decolonizes. There's no Great Depression following World War II. Instead, there's the biggest middle class boom in the history, in recorded history. So that in the years between the late 1940s and 1973, there is the growth of the middle class around the globe that's never been superseded in size. So my father worked in a factory, and we bought a home during that middle class economic boom. And then the fascist militarism was defeated. And so it's no more Hitler and Hirohito. Instead, you have liberal democracy in Germany and Japan, at least in the part of Germany that's in the West, and all of Japan, because there's no division of Japan, although there almost wasn't. And so the image and reality of capitalism has shifted from one extreme to the other, and so the promise of socialism doesn't look the same anymore. Now, socialism is what compared to capitalism? Well, standard of livings are much lower. Even social redistribution, economic redistribution is much worse, and I could go on. And so it's this trick that history plays in the interwar period to excuse all of the problems of socialism, no matter how many people are killed, right? So in 1928...
Just to interrupt,
Yes.
Stephen, that interwar period is very important in shaping Indian anti-colonial elites. So, for example, the Indian National Congress, at the end of British rule, itself has a state planning committee headed by Subhash Chandra Bose.
Yes.
Right? And Nehru himself makes that, I think, 1929 trip to Soviet Union to an industrial plant. So really, like, listening to you was like listening to kind of the options, and frankly, the utopian, idealistic, well-meaning options available to Indian leaders, around 1947. So it really is an echo. But Mr. Chandramouli, how are we doing on time? Yeah, open
Let
to
me
all.
just say
Okay.
one more thing about this question, because you're right. So in 1928, in the Soviet Union, 1% of the arable land, 1% had been voluntarily collectivized. And it was those peasants who couldn't farm who went into the voluntary collectives, and it was 1% of arable land. So there's no way to take away people's property voluntarily. You can only do it through mass coercion. There is no path to power electorally for taking away people's properties and liberties. You can only do it with a party of a new type, as Lenin called the Communist Party that he established in this case. And so the realization of how much coercion is necessary to transcend capitalism and get to socialism was lost on most people. The idea that this would happen in some natural process or some voluntary process, that people would relinquish their property, as modest as it was, and their civil liberties in order to achieve some type of utopia, was never true in reality. It was a fantasy that intellectuals held. And when it was implemented, it was clear the scale of violence that was necessary. In fact, Mao, having seen how many people were killed in Stalin's collectivization, instead of being inhibited, he went and did it again, knowing that people would die in really big numbers.
He killed even larger numbers.
Yes, well, he had more people to work with.
Professor, I just have a question. Now that we have Mr. Trump coming back as the president, and we have been, of course, following what he is talking about Ukraine and the Middle East. I just wanted to get your sense of how his coming back would impact what is happening in Ukraine, and do you see that there is a way out now? And also, we also realized that much as President Biden wanted to change a bit of his policies earlier, but on China, I think he broadly continued what President Trump did in his first term. So do you see, once again, a continuation of what he did in the first term, or with China, I'm talking about China, or will there be a change? These are the two questions I wanted to ask.
Shall I take that one? Yes, thank you, Ambassador. That's so I'm not a member of either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party in the United States. They don't represent the political views that I hold. But nonetheless, that's the system that we have, and those are the leaders that we get. So Trump has an enormous capability, really astonishing, to draw attention to himself and the things that he says. And he says them in order to shock people. And then the people are shocked, and Trump is just joyful. He's gleeful that he's achieved his aim. And then he moves on to the next shock and the next news cycle. And so we have to be careful not to fall for the game that he's playing. The game that he's playing of making everyone focus on him, and especially on being outraged by things he might say. So you have a trend in the world which I call insufficient American power. There's insufficient American power in the world. The demand for American power exceeds the supply. What do I mean? What I mean is this. We have global integration and no global governance. So who is the global governance? Well, when it comes to the international financial system, it's the Federal Reserve, which has no mandate to provide global financial governance whatsoever. None legally. But when the global financial crisis happened, which was in large part caused by the United States, but not exclusively, only the Federal Reserve granted drawing rights for the European banks. An economy of more than $20 trillion was reliant on the Federal Reserve coming as the lender of last resort to the rescue. And that's Europe, let alone the rest of the world. So there's this crazy thing across security, economics, where American power is often seen as the answer. Again, maybe because there's no other option. Maybe people would prefer another option. And so you see Obama comes into office, very well-spoken, very lawyer-like, dean of a law school type of feel, running the superpower. And he wants to reduce America's footprint, to invest at home, to build at home. And the world keeps interceding. And so he pulls out of Iraq, and then ISIS arises in Iraq, and America has to go in its perception, back to Iraq, where it just came out. And then there's the Syria episode that you know well, where Obama draws the red line and then doesn't. And then there's the Libya, where he does intercede. And so one thing after another, Obama, who's trying to reduce America's footprint, constantly responding to the demands that America get involved, that America increase its footprint. And then Trump comes along, lambasting all of these Obama mistakes and idiocies, talking about America first and investing at home and pulling the drawbridge up. And the next thing you know, we're in a global confrontation with China across all domains under Trump. And then Biden comes in, similar. We need to rebuild at home. We need to get manufacturing back. We need to have a green economy. And what do you see? You see a lot of allies demanding that Ukraine be admitted into NATO and that America extend its security guarantee to Ukraine. And you see demands for an American-Saudi security treaty under Biden, which is discussed among the diplomats as a real option. So you see more demands for more American commitments, even as there's a recognition that America can't potentially meet all its current commitments. The Pentagon, not that long ago, had a defense strategy, public, which was two major wars simultaneously, two major power wars in two different theaters simultaneously. And then it was reduced to 1.5. And now it's reduced to 1. So that's our policy. We can fight one major war in one theater at any one time. And of course, you know how the world is working now. And there are multiple wars ongoing in multiple theaters. And they're interconnected now in ways that people didn't foresee. So there's this insufficient American power in the world problem. ironically, because everyone is critiquing American power. America, too much power, too much say, too much sway, too much involvement, too much interventionism. That's the critique you hear. And from Washington point of view, you're sitting in the Oval Office, or even worse, if you're down in the Situation Room in the basement, it's, what are we going to do? Everyone is demanding we fix this and we fix that, and we can't fix all this. So that's what Trump is inheriting. The two pieces on Ukraine that are important to understand. Trump negotiated with the Taliban for a disgraceful exit from Afghanistan. You can argue that the Americans shouldn't have been in Afghanistan, but the exit, the way the exit happened, to my view, was disgraceful. Leaving Bagram Air Base in the middle of the night and deserting the people who had sacrificed everything to be partners with America, not informing the allies. But Trump had started that negotiation with the Taliban. And the Taliban almost got a meeting in the Oval Office, a photo opportunity in the Oval Office. And then Biden came to office, and he decided to continue that policy that Trump had started, and Biden got blamed for the disgraceful exit from Afghanistan. So here we are now, where Biden is messed up the Ukraine support against Russia, and Trump comes into office, and if Ukraine loses the war, who's going to get the blame? Will it be Biden or will it be Trump? And so Trump, having criticized Biden for the disgraceful Afghanistan withdrawal, is now inheriting something very similar and carrying it out and being similarly disgraced. So that's really worrisome to the Trump crowd right now. The other piece on this Ukraine that's worth considering is Nixon in Vietnam. Nixon campaigned on ending the war in Vietnam and promised that we would get out and that our boys would come home and the whole story. And he won the election. And then he discovers that the North Koreans won't negotiate. So he wants to end the war, but the other side, the belligerent on the other side, doesn't want to end the war, certainly not on terms that Nixon can accept. So Nixon initiates a massive bombing campaign, what's called escalate to de-escalate. And so crazy as it sounds, Trump could be in that same position, where he wants to get out, reduce his commitment, but Putin decides he doesn't want to hand Trump a victory. And so why would he do that? Only if tremendous pressure were brought to bear on him. So Trump tweeting, or whatever it's called now, I'm not on social media so I don't know, but whatever that thing is called that he's doing, saying he's going to get out and get out of the war. If Putin doesn't hand Trump a victory, and there's no reason he would, then Trump could be in this crazy position, either of looking like Biden coming out of Afghanistan, or looking like Nixon having to escalate the war crazily in order to try to bring Putin to the table for some negotiation. So I don't envy Trump's position in this because our policy has not been fully successful.
Yeah, we'll just take one last question. One question.
Okay.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon. My name is Edha. I'm in my junior year at a school named Sishaw MR. So I am very much interested in international politics and the UN and what they do. So in regarding terms to Russia, and you've made it very clear that you're not part of the bureaucracy, so you're not able to answer questions like that. So Russia is very famous, at least the Putin regime as of now, for violating multiple territorial treaties. UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea, UN Charter, Chapter 7, Article 51. They keep going on, and somehow it's all retracing back to how Stalin took over. So Putin seems to be reenacting exactly how Stalin took care of his regime back in the day, and now Putin is doing the same. So this entire race for Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk, I'm sorry for my pronunciation, I know I'm killing it, but the race for these states in Ukraine, when do we see an official end? Because if Putin continues the same retracing steps of Stalin, I think we're going towards failure. At least that's what I think. So I would love to hear your opinion on that as well.
It's tragic what's happening, right? All the wars, tragic. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and that's what it is. What's happening in Syria, Sudan, Yemen, historic Palestine, Lebanon, and many other places that we could mention around the world. So we're focusing on the Russia-Ukraine one, but there's a lot of hurt. Civilian populations paying a very big price in many places. Putin doesn't have the capabilities that Stalin had, and never will. Russia is self-weakening, massively self-weakening. Russia's military equipment is not as good as people thought, which is a very salient point here for those of you buying it. Putin is not a grand strategist. He's not even a tactical genius. His Syria incursion, which many people thought was a stroke of genius, has now blown up in his face. We'll see if he holds on to the 2 military bases, which are the logistics hubs for all his support of dictators in Africa, as you know. There's an unraveling of Russian power in a really big way, and there's that mortgaging of the future. And so in some ways, there's an act of desperation going on here with Putin's attempt to hold on to pieces of territory that the Soviet Union held and that Tsarist Russia held. The Ukrainians are the ones bearing the brunt of this, and that's because there's a NATO alliance. And those countries which are in NATO, which have the NATO security guarantee, he hasn't touched any of them in the same way. Yes, there's arson, where there are suspicious fires in warehouses, there's cyber warfare, there are undersea cables getting cut, there's all sorts of what's called hybrid warfare underway, but there's no direct attack on a NATO country that would trigger the NATO alliance mechanism. And that's because if that happens, he's either toast or it's nuclear holocaust, right? Which are not good options for him, A or B. And so how do we manage this act of desperation? What should be our way to wind down the aggression so that the civilian population of Ukraine can rebuild and can enjoy the fruits of hard work and entrepreneurialism and the education that their students your age would like to get, and that the Russian boys and girls don't die as well, because 700,000 casualties, not all deaths, but many seriously wounded, is a really big number, and we could get to 1 million before this is over. Those are just, I mean, how do you fathom that? So the trick is some way to put enough pressure on the Putin regime so that he feels his regime is at stake. Deterrence with authoritarian regimes is not economic sanctions, shaving some points off their GDP. I got to tell you, they don't care very much because they don't pay that price if their GDP goes down. It's not killing their soldiers because they don't care about the lives of their own people. The pressure point, the deterrence, and this goes vis-a-vis China, it goes vis-a-vis Iran, it goes vis-a-vis North Korea, is about the survivability or not of those regimes. And if they feel that their regime is under threat, they pull back. And if they don't feel that their regime is under threat, if their GDP is suffering, if their people are dying, they can continue on the path that they're on. And so how do you put pressure on the political space, not just the economic space, not just the battlefield, but on the political regime? And you'll know that the Biden administration policy has been to take regime change off the table, to say we're not going to do that. In other words, we're not going to pressure Putin's regime politically. And therefore, he's going to keep doing what he's doing. Sure, we have the economic pressure. Sure, we'll try to supply them with weapons on the battlefield, even though they have no soldiers anymore on the Ukrainian side. And so I find this paradoxical, that we'll risk escalation with very severe battlefield pressure, high-tech weapons included, and we'll risk escalation with economic sanctions greater than people expected and certainly greater than previously imposed. But we won't risk political machinations, political pressure, because we fear that that's too escalatory, whether that's vis-a-vis Ukraine or vis-a-vis China. So that's why we're in the situation that we're in. That's why the policy is failing. That's why there's not sufficient pressure on the Putin regime to bring him to the table, to have an armistice, kind of Korean Peninsula style, where they don't necessarily concede annexation of the territory, but they can't remove the occupation, and they get an armistice, which means an end to the major fighting, and then some type of ability to rebuild, right? So we're far from that right now, and Trump is far from that, and it could well be that Putin decides not to accommodate Trump, but to humiliate him. And if he does decide to humiliate Trump, look out. Because all of Trump's discussions about pacifism and withdrawing and America first, you humiliate that guy and he becomes an angry SOB. So I hope we get a negotiated armistice, an end to the war without significant escalation. But I'm not very optimistic about that. But India has a huge moment of opportunity here. Unbelievable moment of opportunity. Because those autocratic states have huge vulnerabilities and weaknesses that are being revealed more and more and more by their own self-defeating policies and failures. They look 10 feet tall, but they have feet of clay. And so India is a democratic country. It's an unbelievable success. And it has an opportunity to play a role here because it has a big voice, and its voice is getting larger. To stand up for certain values internationally, not to play a neutrality hedging game, as it has up till now, but to take sides in a way that supports India's room for maneuver and sovereignty in the international system and India's domestic development. And that's your choice. No one can force you. You're a sovereign nation and you make your own choices. The non-alignment movement failed. Bandung failed. And it failed because there's this big thing called China and this big thing called India, and they don't have overlapping interests, even if they use sometimes common anti-American rhetoric. And so you will find that, again, that the Chinese they're serious. They're playing for keeps. And they're going to do what they say they're going to do, and we know because they're doing it every day. And so that's your fate in your hands, and you figure that out. And God bless.
Thank you so much, sir. That was a lovely session. Thank you so much. May I now request Ambassador T.S. Trimurthy to hand over the mementos?
Thank you all. Really, very humble to be here.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.